Okay, well, I think we can get started. So welcome to those who've just joined. Welcome to this special webinar, Design for Non-Designers in our Lunch and Learn series. My name is Paul, and just a little bit of quick housekeeping for today's session. So today's session will be recorded and we'll share it in the community by next week. And also we'll run for about 45 minutes and I'll stay back for an extra 15 minutes in case there's any questions along the way. So just to note that we've got Dawn, our VP of Success, on this call as well, and she'll be keeping an eye on the chat for me while I'm presenting, and she might answer some of your questions and keep some of them at the end for me to answer as well. So today's session, I'm just going to do a very quick little kind of recap of my design background, just to kind of give the impetus for this session and to share some of the skills that I've learned from my time as a designer. Then the majority of the session will actually be covering some tips to improve your design. So looking at the different elements on your page, whether that's a web page or a printed page, and how you can improve them. And then throughout the session, you'll see that there's some resources. So you don't have to worry about copying down the links or trying to take down too many notes. I will share this presentation itself right at the end for you to keep. So it'll be a sort of a takeaway that you can use as a framework or a reference when you're working on your next project, and you can use it as a sort of a checklist to use towards revamping some of your designs. And as mentioned, we'll keep some time at the end for questions. I didn't mention it, but there is a Q&A field in Zoom. So if you do have any questions itself, you can pop it directly in there, and then Dawn will be able to answer it there or keep some aside for me. So just a very quick little snippet about me. So my name is Paul. I'm part of the customer team at Shorthand. I've been with Shorthand for 3 years, but before working at Shorthand, I actually started out as a designer. So my journey in design actually started off with a love for words, and I wanted to be a copywriter. But during that process, I realized that I really loved the way that words were presented on a page, and in particular in magazines and newspapers. So I went on to do my master's in publishing, and from there I worked as a production editor at a newspaper, an art director at a magazine, and worked then as a design studio manager at a small communications agency. So with all of that kind of experience over the years, I've accumulated some knowledge in design that I've shared with my customers in my time at Shorthand. And I wanted to do the session as an opportunity to really kind of share some of that to help you take your content to the next level, whether it's a piece that you're creating in Shorthand itself, or maybe it's a newsletter you're producing or a printed annual report. All these principles really apply to everything that you do. So if you'd like to connect with me afterwards, welcome to any feedback that you have. Please connect with me on LinkedIn, or if you have any other kind of questions related to the session, you're always welcome to reach out to me then. And as mentioned, I will share a link to this presentation afterwards, so you have access to all the links and resources. So before we dive straight into the different tips and tricks and things that I want to cover today, I just wanted to mention that this is very much a starting point in anyone's design journey. If design isn't necessarily your main role at your company, but it's something that you're doing regularly, there's always a jumping off point where you can start and then build upon. So today's session really is to give you that platform, that jumping off point, to give you the kind of core tips and tricks and some theory within design. And then from there, there's further reading that you can then expand upon and take it further. So this is truly that starting point. And I do believe that everyone can be a great designer. It's really just about using that intuition and then putting that within a framework so that you can then apply it. So when you see something that you really like, maybe you've opened up a magazine and you thought the magazine was beautiful, or you were shared a link to a website and you thought it looked really great, but you weren't really sure why you liked it so much. This webinar hopefully will give you that framework for you to be able to see, okay, I understand why this works really well, and how can I apply that to my designs? And then one thing that I would be remiss not to mention is that your designs will really only be as strong as your planning and the materials that you have. So I always ask my customers just to first take a step back and look at the materials that you have, really plan it out, maybe storyboard it, get a sense of how it's all going to look. And then once you know the assets and the material that you have and you've planned it, then you can get creative and design it. So if you are interested in learning more about planning, it's a whole topic in and of itself, but we do have some really handy guides out there that is a great starting point before you even get into the designing of your content, whether it is print or digital. Something I'd recommend is the Behind the Story series. This is where we've actually interviewed various shorthand customers on how they've produced stories, their content journey, their planning and their creation of it, and giving you a bit of a behind the scenes look into it. And there's a lot of tips and tricks that you can learn from that. We also have a really great collection of support documents on how to start planning out your project that actually translates to other things outside of shorthand. So any other projects that you might be working on as well. So it's a really handy link as well. And then we have a really great multimedia planning checklist. So if you're interested in producing a multimedia story in shorthand or elsewhere, there's some really handy tips in that as well. And as mentioned, for those who've just joined, everything that I'm showing and sharing here today, I will share a follow-up link at the end of the session, and you'll be able to click out to these different further resources. So with that said, the first thing I want to talk about is typography. So before we jump into typography, I think it's quite important to understand just very, very basic typography theory around readability versus legibility. So readability ultimately is how comfortable and enjoyable is that reader's experience of your content. So has it got nice images around it? Is the content structured beautifully? Is it intuitive how you navigate through the story? Is there enough white space and breathing room? Whereas legibility is really about the typeface itself. How easy is it to interpret that typeface so that you can read it? One font might look really great in a heading, but not work really well as a body copy. So understanding these differences and how things like legibility can influence the readability is a really good starting point before you even get into picking out fonts. So I just wanted to touch on that because I think it's definitely a whole area in and of itself, and it actually influences the overall reader or viewer's experience with the content that you work really hard on. So it's a very good aspect to really kind of hone and develop further. So when we're looking at improving readability as a starting point, and then we'll get on to actually selecting fonts and tips on doing that. But just as a starting point, if we want to look at improving readability, a font might look really good when you're browsing it online, but the moment you apply it to your body copy, whether that's in an annual report that's printed out or a website that you're designing, it might actually be really hard to read. And that's because we're often seeing that copy or that font in a small snippet online, and we're not really getting a chance to truly see how it's going to look in a larger body of text. So the first thing to do is to really look at, how does this font itself work when used in the way we need to use it? Is it being used for a heading or is it being used for body copy? How does it look? And quite similarly to that is decorative fonts should be used sparingly. They can definitely add a bit of character and personality to a story. And these might be very kind of like over-exaggerated examples of decorative fonts that you probably wouldn't use. But the same principle applies to other ones that you might use. Use them sparingly. They're there to add a bit of a look and feel to it, but they would actually be really hard in large blocks of text or if used a lot. I would rather suggest using that for a smaller bit of text where you really want to bring attention or maybe bring a bit of life and playfulness to it. Added white space can also make longer passages of text easier to read. So if I look at this story that I was actually working on recently, I was looking at the structure of how I improve the structure of a story. And adding white space to my content can actually make the way I read it a lot easier. So adding a bit of space around things means that there's a bit of hierarchy, but also a bit of breathing room around it. So just something to keep in mind when you're going into working with text and how readable and enjoyable it is. Maybe you want to break up that block of text with an embed. Maybe you want to add a tweet or an Instagram post. Maybe you want to add maybe just a short little video or an image, anything to break up that block of text so that it becomes a more enjoyable, readable experience. And then with that in mind, adding those other elements to your story can really help break up that text and make it more readable. So in this example that I have below here, you'll see that we've got a very strong heading, which is styled in its own way. We've got a drop cap and we've bolded that first paragraph. And then we've also got a pull quote over here. And this all helps to break up that block of text in a way that is a lot more readable. If this was just all styled the same way, your reader's easily going to lose their place within it. They're not going to really understand the flow, and they're not going to be able to work their way through it. So with that in mind, selecting a good font that's legible too will then further enhance that. So now that you have that kind of basic understanding of readability and legibility, the next question might be is how do we make better typographic choices? So we understand what we need to look for in a font in terms of how well our reader is going to be able to engage with it and be able to interpret those characters in it. But how do we then go and choose a font that works well in our story? So in this part, I really just want to touch on a few basic tips to get you started. So your brand guidelines should be your starting point. And I'll probably be saying this quite a lot throughout the presentation because it really is the first place that you should start with when choosing fonts to work with. Your brand guidelines are tried and tested. A designer would have put it together. They would know that this font works well as a heading and this font works well with body copy. And this font is really good to use for a pull quote. And you have all of that framework and guardrails already in place that make it a lot easier. And when you know these rules, you can then maybe deviate from them. And you might find that your brand guidelines even has certain things like accent colors or accent fonts. So if you do have maybe a case study that you're styling separately and you want to give it a slightly different look and feel, you can maybe use those accent characteristics to it. So kind of know the rules in summary so that you can then break them and add a bit more creative freedom to it. Another thing to bear in mind is certain softwares and tools that you're using will have themes, templates, and presets. So if you're used to maybe designing something in Microsoft Word, although that's not technically something I would recommend for print purposes, a lot of users use that because it's easily accessible. You might actually have some templates available there already that sets the paragraph styles for you and the heading styles, and everything's in place. And that's always a good starting point. In a tool like Shorthand, we have themes. This is where we create a theme for you that has your brand fonts, your brand colors, and other brand guidelines already kind of baked into it so that whenever you start off your story in Shorthand, it has those guidelines already applied to it, and then you can always deviate and add a little bit to it. So these should always be starting points first before you then go out into trying other things. But with that in mind, you probably will want to bring in a custom font every now and then. And it's essential also to understand how you can select a font that's fit for purpose and also how you can pair that font with other fonts in a way that makes sense and lives well with it. So when it comes to selecting fonts, always ask yourself, does this font match the tone of the story? So it kind of goes back to those decorative fonts that I mentioned earlier. That's a very extreme example, but if it doesn't really add to the story itself or the tone, if you've got a very serious story, you might want to try a more austere and more kind of serious additional font that goes into it, because it might feel a little bit too left-wing to have a font that's completely outside of that look and feel. Aside from legibility, is that font readable in the way that you want to use it? Another thing to ask is, does it pair well with the other fonts? So how does it fit in with the fonts that we already have in the story? And I think one that's often kind of missed is, does it support all the characters that's needed? So most of us are creating content with one character set. Oftentimes it's Roman characters, but if you're producing multilingual content, maybe you're producing a story also in Arabic, you might want to ask yourself, does this font, before you go too far down the line of producing this content and choosing the font for that content, should I say, before you go too far down that line, you might want to ask yourself, does this font actually support Arabic glyphs and characters? Because if not, you might need to select a different font. The font itself might not actually have the Arabic characters in it, but they might have an Arabic variation. And then you know that those different multilingual publications that you're producing do look similar and are cohesive as a whole, but you haven't had to change fonts because you've already done the work in choosing a font that is fit for purpose across all the different use cases. So when it comes to choosing fonts and pairing fonts, as a rule of thumb, and most designers use this, is that we don't pair sans serif fonts with other sans serif fonts, and we don't pair serif fonts with other serif fonts. And just a little kind of crash course on what a sans serif and serif font is, some of you might know, but for those of you who maybe aren't using design regularly or aren't using design isn't your main function, you might not actually know what the difference between it is, but you might have seen it maybe when you're designing something in Microsoft Word and you're selecting the font, you'll see that it says something serif or something sans, but not really understand what it is. And essentially all it really is a serif is this little part at the end of the letters, at the stem of the type. And that adds its own look and feel to it. Whereas a sans serif often is more modern in looking as it doesn't have it and is a lot more cleaner. So that's the difference between it. And the reason why we often say don't pair a serif font with another serif font is because of those similarities, it can feel a bit incongruent. They almost too similar, but their differences make it feel like it's not intentional. So by having a very strong contrast between the two, so having something like a serif font as a heading and a sans serif as body copy, this allows enough variation for those fonts to work well together. Another thing that could also make your life easier when pairing fonts is to choose a superfamily. So superfamilies are fonts that are all from the same stylistic nature, but they have different variations of them. So Roboto is a really great font as an example. Roboto has its general font, which many of us are familiar with. It's a very common web font used, but it also has a serif version and it also has a slab version. So you know already that these fonts all work well together. They're from the same style, so they work well together, but they're different enough that they can be used in different ways. So you might want to use Roboto Serif for headings. You maybe want to use Roboto for just the sans serif one for body copy, and maybe Roboto Slab is then what you use for your pull quotes or case study section, something that's a little bit different that maybe won't be used as often, but then because it's used less, is almost treated as an accent. So that's always a really good starting point when choosing fonts, is to be able to choose fonts that work well together. And as you develop that skill in finding what fonts work well together, a good starting point is using superfamilies. Next, another way of pairing fonts is choosing fonts from the same style or design period, foundry or designer. Oftentimes they'll have a very similar aesthetic. And if you do want to be a little bit more adventurous, I would say this is the next starting point for you. After venturing outside of superfamilies, look at fonts that are made by the same designer. They often have a similar aesthetic and you'll know that they generally live well. It won't be a set rule for everything, but it's a really nice way of then starting to test your design skills and start seeing how things work well together. If you'd like to learn more about typography, I'd highly recommend Google Fonts Knowledge Base. They have a lot of really handy support guides there that go more in depth into sans serif and serif fonts, how to pair fonts well, fonts that work better for digital versus print. Some really great documents there. And they also have a link out to the Find Out How Type Works book. It's a very well-known book in the type field, and it's now available for free under a Creative Commons license. So all these links are going to be shared in the presentation afterwards, but just to let you know that these are available and they're really wonderful resources in your journey in type. The next thing I wanted to look at is hierarchy. So hierarchy is something that is incredibly important in design. So I often think of it in terms of this quote that you see on the right-hand side, in that if you feel that a page feels cluttered or uneasy to navigate, or you're not really sure where you are or what is the next step for you in the journey, it's very often the case that it's lacking visual hierarchy. There's not enough cues throughout the story to tell the reader where they need to go next and the journey that they need to take. Because hierarchy ultimately is basically telling the reader what is the most important thing on this page and what is the next important thing and how you take them through that journey. So in terms of quick tips on improving hierarchy, I've mentioned it earlier, but planning is probably going to be the best way to approach it. When you understand the structure of your content and the content groups within it, maybe there's little pull quotes that you have that you're going to bringing attention to, little case studies, maybe sound bites. You'll want to know how to approach each of those things and how to structure it in the story. And by planning that in advance, you're not going to sit with a design that you then need to kind of retrofit within it, but rather when you have those that framework that you've developed from planning it, you'll be able to then know, okay, this is how I'm going to treat this section. This is how I'll treat all these headings and subheadings. And ultimately, you'll have a more intuitive story that's got really great hierarchy for the reader to navigate through. So, for example, in the way I've presented this session, you'll see that all the different sections within here have a big image and large text for the subheadings. This is the indicator to my reader that this is a whole different content stream, and everything underneath that falls within it. Same with my subheadings and even tertiary level headings. They have their set styles so that whenever you're going through a different part of content, you know that this heading is a main heading, this heading falls under it, and your reader doesn't have to do any guesswork of where they are within the story, but rather that they can just enjoy the story or the whatever it is that you're producing and not have to do the guesswork around to navigate within it. The size and the color of elements on the page will also collectively influence the hierarchy within there. So if you have a box with additional content that's in red and it's big, it's probably going to draw the reader's attention there first before they're even noticing a heading. So you might want to consider maybe having the heading in a green and then the box in a muted green so that it feels like it lives together with it, but it's not actually pulling the attention away from the main hierarchy, the main structure of the page. So using these kind of elements, especially in the planning stage, is really going to help you work at how you create these different styles for each of the elements on the page. And then lastly, just proper spacing and alignment and proximity will greatly improve the perceived hierarchy and readability of any material. So if I jump back into the story, and the same applies for print as well, if I were to remove some of the spacing here, although it is logical that this text follows on from this subheading, if we look at it in space, it's actually all equally spaced out. And for the reader, we might not truly understand what relates to it. And even if it is clear to us as we're reading it, there's a sort of mental load that the design takes on us because subconsciously we're trying to understand how everything relates to each other. So by adding a bit of white space above headings, we're clearly saying that this section belongs to this, and there's no confusion where it sits in space to this section. Same with alignment. If I were to set this text to the right, we're now signifying to the reader that there's something different about this section to this section. So why have we not been consistent with it? So by making sure that we have consistency, we're also ensuring that the hierarchy is simple and easy to understand to the reader. If you're very kind of interested and you'll probably realize the value in visual hierarchy from the session, I would highly recommend having a look at this quick intro into hierarchy principles by the Nielsen Norman Group. It's very quick, but it goes quite detailed into the different principles around it that you can quickly apply to your stories and will make a huge difference. Another really useful resource is this deep dive into visual hierarchy from Interaction Design Foundation. They actually go into what is visual hierarchy, but also look at each of those principles in depth and give you a little bit more detail in how to apply that into the stories that you create. Next is color. So we won't go in depth into any kind of color theory as itself because it's quite complicated and it's very much a thing in and of itself and maybe a separate session altogether. But I did want to leave you with some questions when using color in your stories because colors create such a big impact in your stories because they're signaling something to the reader or the viewer of the piece that you've created. So these are some questions to ask when selecting a color. How does the color align with my brand guidelines? So sometimes when we're adding colors into a story, a report, a publication that we're working on, we're adding it because we really like the color, but we're not really looking at it holistically in how it relates to everything else there. And in theory, as we're selecting colors, it might sound really nice, but when we put it next to all the other content, it might feel quite jarring and like it's completely different. If your brand guidelines have mostly pastel or muted colors and you suddenly bring in a very strong color, it might feel like it doesn't really live within it. So do ask yourself, even if the color looks really good, how does it live with everything else that you're doing? Another question to ask, and quite an important one, is what emotional connotations does this color evoke? So I always use the example with my customers with buttons. Um, if you're doing a campaign and maybe it's for a not-for-profit and you have a call to action at the end and it's a button, maybe it's to donate money or to support a cause, you might want to have a big red button that says act now and really grabs your attention and has a really nice finality to the action for the reader. But maybe you're a different type of not-for-profit and you're doing something more sensitive in nature. Maybe it's around mental health or some kind of disease or illness, and you want to offer help and support. You probably wouldn't have a get help button in that strong color. You'd probably use something with a different connotation. Maybe it's a more pastel blue or pastel pink, something that feels more compassionate and more evokes caring. So even though a color might feel like it's there just to lift up a piece that you're designing, it's actually got its own connotations around it. And a lot of times these are subconscious, sometimes it's cultural. And so it's really important to think when you're designing it, what am I trying to say by using this color? And again, going back to that planning stage, when you know what the colors are and the structure of your documents and how you want to apply these colors and these fonts, you'll be able to understand very clearly what fits in where when designing your content. The next question to ask is, how is the color affecting my reader's understanding of the content? I mentioned it a little bit earlier with hierarchy, that if we put some text in a big red box, we're actually signaling to the reader that this is where I want your eye to go first. This is the most important thing on the page. So we might be choosing it because we think it's a really nice color to sit behind this content and just to set it aside from everything else, but it actually might be signaling to the reader that this is what I want you to read first. So again, asking yourself, is this the right thing for this type of content that I'm producing? Maybe I want to use a muted shade of it, a tint of that color to kind of make it recede a little bit more into the layout and take my reader through a more natural progression through the story. Another one to consider is this color easy to read when used for text? So first prize is always black text against white background. That gives us the highest contrast, and we know in terms of readability and legibility, this is going to be easiest for people to read, especially those maybe with visual impairments. That said, we can still use color in text. It's more about how we use it and the contrast is there. So maybe you want to use color for headings. Those are always great because headings tend to have a bigger font, they tend to be a bolder font, and therefore there's still strong enough contrast against the background. But it is something to keep in mind just in terms of how readable that content is going to be, and to rather use it for select things like pull quotes and headings. And then the last thing to consider with choosing color is, how does this color live with the others in my piece, or does it feel out of place? This is a very important one, and it kind of leads back to the first one. And that allows us to kind of really ask the question is like, how do we then select those colors that feel like they live with the piece and fit in with what we're creating? So as mentioned already, follow those brand guidelines. You might even find somewhere in the brand guidelines is an accent color, something that has been tried and tested and your designers know works well with your brand. But if not, there are different ways of choosing colors logically that actually will make sense to the story and also takes the guesswork away from you for having to try and work out what color to use. So one of those is using a color scheme or using image as an inspiration. So in my kind of read more additional resources, I've linked out to some resources on color theory. So if you'd like to learn a bit more about the actual theory behind color, I'd highly recommend that article. But the color scheme is a really interesting one. So I've actually got it open here just to show you. So when it comes to color theory, there's different ways of choosing colors and also how they complement each other. So basically, you can have color schemes that complement a bit more closely, as well as those that actually have more of a dynamic relationship to each other. They have more contrast. So by choosing the different kind of color harmony rules, you'll be able to choose colors that do work well together, but work well in different ways and make sense to your piece. So this is always another way to, or another tool to add to your toolkit in how do you choose colors in a logical way that you know works, but also make sense with everything else you're designing. Another great one is the color palette generator. So I really like this. If you're doing maybe a standalone piece, you have a bit more freedom around it, but you're not really sure where to start with the colors that you use in it. I always think the best place to start is choosing an image that really evokes the nature of the piece and then developing a color palette from there. Maybe it's that main hero image that's at the start of your story, and using a tool like Canva's color palette generator, you can actually upload the image and it will create the colors for you. And you'll know that they work well because it relates to a piece that's already in, or a piece of an asset that's already in your story or your publication. Next is working with images. So this is something I'm very passionate about. Just as an editorial designer, I did a lot of this in previous roles, and I think there's so much scope to improve images that we have. Oftentimes we're looking at images and thinking that they might not work, but there's actually a lot that we can do with images to make them work and look a bit better. We might not always have the resources to commission a whole photo shoot or bring in illustrators. So how do we work with what we have to get the best out of those images? So the first one, and probably one that many of us know, is the rule of thirds. So you can see that we have two images, they're the exact same images, but they're cropped slightly differently. So the rule of thirds basically says you're splitting up your image into 9 equal blocks, and you're structuring the way your image is cropped according to that. So the image by itself has the focal point right in the middle. It has this rock, this boulder right over here. Whereas on the right-hand side, that image has been cropped slightly differently so that the horizon lines up with the bottom third, and the vertical lines up with the first third of the image. And what this does is it actually creates a little bit of tension in the image, taking that focal point out of the center, takes it away from feeling quite simple and plain, and gives a really nice dynamic and creates a visual tension within it. And it's not changing the image, it's not taking a new picture, it's just choosing a different crop of it to create that more impactful image out of it. Another thing that I see coming up quite often is cropping people. When it comes to displaying portraits of people together, they can often look a little bit disorganized. Oftentimes, people are facing different directions, their heads are different sizes, and it can just feel like they just don't work well together. And we see this a lot with things like annual reports, where maybe it's a selection of board members that have been added, and the pictures just don't really look like they work well together. So one little tip is to really look closely at their body positions, the size of their heads, and how their heads are positioned within each image. And it really makes a big difference, because once we get the heads all to a similar size by zooming into them, getting them all on the same vertical and on horizontal within each row, you'll see that they line up a lot neater. Another thing that I've also done is the order of the images have changed. So if we look at the nature of the way the bodies are positioned, the guy in the bottom right, he's sort of angling towards the image. So when he was in this first image, he's actually looking out of the paragraph, out of this block of text, and it visually takes your eye away from it. So by moving him back to the bottom right, we're allowing him to kind of draw the reader's eye back into the image. And the same with the woman in the bottom left. We've moved all the way down to kind of create that. So looking at these very small key principles in how the way the reader's eyes work in a design can actually make a big difference in your images. And it can go from something that feels quite disparate into something that feels quite cohesive. Another thing that also can make a big difference is being careful where you crop people. So as a rule of thumb, we always say don't crop through anatomical joints. It sounds quite painful, but it also makes the image look quite disjointed, if you will. It feels very unnatural if you crop through a joint, through a elbow or through a knee. It just doesn't feel natural to the eye. And even though it's on a subconscious level, we can already see that it doesn't look that great. Whereas if we crop maybe just below the elbow, and we also use the rule of third, yeah, we now have a better crop of the image, but we also have a bit of more tension in it. And we get to work with this vertical building that draws us right into the center of the image as well. So we're always looking at different cues within the image and how we can frame it and lead the reader's eye better through it. Speaking of directional cues, So always looking at the directional cues within the images. It's not always faces that's doing. Sometimes it's quite obvious things like an arrow. Naturally, your eye is going to follow that arrow when it's looking at something. So this works perfectly well. It's directing our reader straight down into the story, into the next section. But maybe for this next image, it's not working so well because it's actually causing our reader's eye to move away to the top right. So an image like this could actually work really well at the end of a story or a web page, because maybe you have a button that's a contact us button, and naturally she's in thought, she's kind of directing her eyes towards something. What is it that we're going to put there that's going to help the reader follow through with that and have a final action? So somewhere in the middle of a story, this image maybe doesn't work so well, but at the end it could work really well. So always looking at the directional cues within the images. And then just a little note on quality over quantity. So there is that expression that it takes one bad apple to spoil the bunch. And I think the same goes with images. Adding one low resolution image can actually detract from an otherwise beautiful publication. And it can feel like just something is a mistake, that maybe the image is meant to be swapped out. So when in doubt, rather just use what you have. Less is more. You might have spent a lot of money on commissioning a photographer and a whole photo shoot. It doesn't mean that you necessarily need to use all of those images as well. Maybe you can repurpose it in a different way. So maybe you want to be able to use that image for social media posts. That's a great way of using it. Maybe there'll be secondary content that you develop down the line, or maybe it fills up your image database that you're slowly building. And there's always a place for those additional images, but you don't have to use all of them to get that full value for them. Another thing to also ask is, does the image actually add value? A great image is a great image, but when added into a story, if it's not adding value, it's just adding visual clutter to the story. So we're always looking at ways to minimize the amount of elements and visual clutter in the story so that the story feels like it has some breathability to it, and it's just containing the important elements that need to be in there. Nothing that feels like it's a filler. And lastly, using stock images wisely. So I do believe that there is a place for stock images. I think when stock images are used excessively and when they're used also as main elements in the story, they can feel sometimes like they're waiting to be replaced, like they might be placeholder elements. But when used intentionally, maybe it's as kind of background images that add a bit of a look and feel to the story that you're creating, they can work really well. And as such, I actually used a lot of stock images behind the section headings of my presentation today, because they just add a bit of context to what I'm doing, but they're not actually the focal point. I would want to use a more important visual for my focal point, but as a background image, it works really well. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about background images and how to work with images and how to improve your images, I'd highly recommend looking at this article, Using Imagery in Design, another one from the Nielsen Norman Group. There's really wonderful resources on our website, and I've linked out to quite a lot of them just because they have so much information that can be readily applied to the content that you're creating. Another thing to just bring a bit of a shout out to is image filters and enhancements. So within Shorthand, we have image filters and we also have an enhancement AI tool within Shorthand. And so maybe you do have a low resolution image. Before completely discarding it, you might want to add it to the enhancement feature, see if it helps improve that image. It's always good to just see if it works. And another thing to also mention, just with like image filters, you might have a lot of images coming from various sources, and when you're putting those images together, they might feel so dissimilar and look like they don't live together. Image filters are a really great way to create a bit of a cohesive look to all the images by having a sort of a certain look and feel that's applied to all of them that then ultimately ties them together. And with images, having tools available to edit them is going to make the biggest difference. If you do want to apply some of these things like the rule of thirds, or if you're trying to crop your images of people together and want to make sure that they line up well and they're the same size and they work well together, you're probably going to need a really good tool to do that. And I highly recommend Canva because they do have a free offering, but they also do have a paid for version and there's some additional assets there. So we definitely recommend that if you don't have an image editing tool to maybe start there. It's a really good product. And then lastly, before we get to the closing and time for some questions, I just wanted to mention, and this is something I'm quite passionate about, it's around designing a digital world for all. So this relates mostly to digital storytelling. And what the digital world has allowed us to do is to reach more people. And so it's important now more than ever for us to be able to design our content in a way that is accessible to everyone. So there's definitely some tips and tricks that we can apply throughout that will really help our readers be able to consume the media and consume it in a meaningful way. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is performance. So ensuring that the stories that you create are they perform well and they perform well in the regions that you're trying to target. If you're targeting communities in different nations that maybe have slower internet, maybe higher mobile data fees, you might want to have less video heavy content. You want to make sure that it's compressed and truly is possible for them to engage with that media. Many of us know already that most readers consume their media mobile first. It will vary according to different use cases and content types, but as a whole, most people are consuming media on their devices first. So I always strongly suggest when you're developing your content on the web that you're testing across different browsers and different devices as you're going along. It's often the case that these are saved as a sort of an afterthought afterwards. So as a way to kind of check that it works on mobile once you finish the content. But actually, you might find that there's a lot of stumbling blocks that happen if you leave it to right to the end. But if you make it part of your workflow from the very beginning, as you're creating the content and you're checking to see how it looks, you can save a lot of time and make sure that the experience is optimized for the greatest percentage of your readership. Next is accessibility. So with digital tools has come the ability to have a lot of features that can make media a lot more accessible to others. So now more than ever, we should be leveraging that, and that us as content creators should be using these tools so that everyone can take advantage of the media that we create and can experience it in the way that we want them to. So making sure that our media meets accessibility guidelines and that we're aware of what those guidelines are so that we can constantly improve and make sure that our media is inclusive. And then last but not least is diversity. At a click of the button, we can now share our content with the whole world and transcend geographic boundaries. Our audiences are growing and growing and reaching wider and wider. So it's important that the media that we create also uses designs that are inclusive of everyone and of all the voices of our audience so that everyone can feel represented when they're consuming the media that we're creating, and that it's not toned towards one type of person, but rather to everyone, and we can all feel that we're connected. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about these things and how we can improve the media that we create as a whole, we have a great resource on improving page load. We also have a wonderful accessibility checklist to make sure that your stories adhere to accessibility guidelines in shorthand. And there's also a really wonderful article on inclusive design, which touches on that last point. So I'd like to thank you so much for your time today. I know we've run over by a minute. If you do need to get going, thank you so much for staying on. And if you have any questions, feel free to send it to success@shorthand.com. I'll be happy to answer them personally. But if you do have time to stay on and there's questions, I'll have a look at the chat and I'll see if there's anything I can answer. So thanks everyone for the feedback. So I saw that one of the questions that came in while I was presenting was, is there a tool that you recommend for cropping? So it probably came through just before I mentioned Canva, but I highly recommend Canva. It's really easy. And you can also set up grids and guides within Canva so that you can crop according to those guidelines. And I hope that answers your question. And for anyone who's missed it, Dawn's just popped in the chat the resource. So the presentation that I've shared today, it's got all those tips as well as related resources. So if you'd like to learn a bit more, please feel free to click through to that. And if you have any follow-up questions, you're welcome to email me. So that's all the questions that have come through at this stage. If there's any other questions, I will be around for a bit longer if anybody wants to ask. Okay, well, it looks like there's no further questions that have come through. I'd like to thank you all for your time today, and your attention. It's been wonderful to have so many of you here today, and I hope you all have a wonderful day further. Take care.